This is the story of an 8-month voyage to Antarctica in 1996. It was my first trip south, and it would be a baptism of ice.
2 points to start.
I'm warning you, further across the room in a minute.
The ship would be stuck in the ice for over a month in the Weddell Sea. She would be pinned before a 5-mile-wide iceberg. She would burn 2/3 of her fuel getting south and still have to get out again. She would become icebound again in a creek pinned against the Great Ice Shelf. She would ram her way out stern first, and despite suffering 2 holes to her hull, she would continue to complete her season along the Antarctic Peninsula. Just like Shackleton, whose track we would so often follow, she brought us all home safe and sound. In 8 months there were several adventures: boat trips, snowcat trips, skidoo trips, camping trips, even a Land Rover trip. If you can bear the fuzzy old VHS video, then bear with me, because it was a trip to remember. Ships are not like airplanes in that when you travel the world by ship, you still understand exactly how big our world really is. 12 hours in an airplane might get you anywhere. You just open the door and the world has changed, but you still have little concept of the distance covered. A 3-week passage from the River Humber to the River Plate, from grey old Grimsby to sunny Montevideo, leaves you in no doubt about how far the two are apart. The bubbles that slip down the ship's side do so at a speed that you could almost run, a speed that you can therefore fully comprehend. The Merchant Navy is steeped in tradition, but the Bransfield also represented a bygone era. When she retired, much of all this ended with her. Most merchant ships I served on were Met reporting vessels, but we also used to launch Met balloons. These will climb so high into the lower pressure that they will expand to 10 meters before bursting. As we sailed further south, our contributions in this became more valuable in the absence of other reporting ships or stations. Often when in Antarctica, we would report an approaching storm as the barograph began to dive, and only then it would appear on the Met Office charts and forecasts. We regularly used to provision and crew change in Montevideo. About 50 of the Russian fishing fleet ended up here after the fall of the USSR, and they were often left to sink where they were. This is the mast of the Nazi battleship Graf Spee, which was scuttled here after being damaged in the Battle of the River Plate. While taking on bunkers in Mare Harbour, some boat launch practice was taking place when we saw our first hourglass dolphins. These dolphins are only found in Antarctica or sub-Antarctic waters. They accompanied us regularly on our travels. I remember Stanley for its whalebone arch, Land Rovers galore, the Victory Bar and the Lady Elizabeth. Known locally as the Lady Liz, the ship was launched in Sunderland in the UK in 1879 and suffered damage whilst rounding Cape Horn in 1913. She limped into Stanley for repairs, but the high cost prevented these from being carried out, and so here she remains. We dropped anchor to supply Bird Island. Bird Island Sound between the two islands there is famously rough. Anchor watch was pleasant under a bright moon with radar ranges set. It was an easy night on the bridge before a busy day ahead working cargo. This island is off the northwest tip of South Georgia and is a nesting ground for the mighty albatross. It is also home for many fur seals, as you see here. Many of the smaller bases of the British Antarctic Survey involve a great deal of manhandling of cargo because there are no proper port facilities. One of the things I loved most about this job was the amount of boat work. We then anchored in Grytviken. I would come here often in the years to come. It is an old whaling station. It is full of history, old and recent. But for me, a highlight was always a visit to the final resting place of Sir Ernest Shackleton. There were still military personnel based here at this time, but it was being built up as a research station instead. Here you can see the bullet holes from the fighting which took place between Argentina and Britain in 1982, some 15 years earlier. Myself and Nick Bailey got into trouble at this cove later in the season. Launching into surf, Nick's engine failed shortly after hauling up his anchor, and his rib was quickly thrown up onto the slab rocks beside the beach. I managed to get a line up to him and tow him off, but that alone was a story in itself. Nick and I had scientists for crew, and this left us short on the help of sailors' hands, which left rope near props, and a slapstick comedy of quite unfunny disasters followed. Sea temperature from here on in made potentially big problems out of even relatively small mishaps. In the distance you see the James Clark Ross. I would spend the following 2 years on board that ship. She was a fascinating and sophisticated research ship and brought me into both the Antarctic and Arctic ice. Icebreaking was both a learned skill and an absolute thrill. Captain Stuart Lawrence had the skill to delegate the thrill to his officers, and we all loved him for it. I learned so much under his command. I recalled that he took command of the Bransfield in the year that I was born, which left me permanently humbled by him and his experience. Bransfield had a hull to be reckoned with, and this season this would be proven. She was plated with 60mm polar grade steel, where normal ships might be a quarter of that, and furthermore her frames were much closer than normal. Finally, she was double hulled throughout, and she was diesel electric and also had a variable pitch propeller, and this made her very versatile.
Well, through this chaos, that's all cool. About 2 points to start.
I warn you, if you turn across the room in a minute.
Don't know what he's doing. He may be even going astern. Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Never mind the bang. Oh, that looks pretty good. Yeah, that's good.
We have the front of the
Right on.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do this call to say one for you.
I believe it was one of the biggest DC motors around at the time, and this made her very versatile. However, she was an ice-class cargo ship, not a dedicated icebreaker. If you make room for cargo, you must give up on horsepower. Ships like the Polar Stern were far more powerful, probably 3 times more powerful than us, and this meant we had to back and fill quite a lot. Which is to say, we had to ram the ice as fast as we could in order to make way, where a more powerful ship might ease herself up onto the ice and break it with a little more grace. This, in turn, meant we had to be bloody careful what we pointed her at.
We know where we've come from. That's the bank service or gets off.
Now then, 3 out. Well, I don't recommend that. I think they'll try and hang around this bit. It's just getting this little sticky corner.
Some types of relatively new ice you can break with your hull, and other types of multi-year ice, or bergy butts, will break your hull instead. Captain Lawrence was there to teach us one from the other. Progress in the Weddell Sea that year was exceptionally slow. The spring storms that would normally break up the ice had failed to do so, meaning that there was far more pack ice than before. Still, it was not long before we met our first snow petrel, one of the few birds ever to be found at the South Pole. We had 70 people on board, half crew and half base personnel or other staff such as a doctor. Well, we were busy and worked all day and night on the bridge and in the engine room. These were long and tedious days for many others aboard. There was no internet, of course, and very little in the way of satellite communications, mostly just HF. Some form of entertainment became increasingly important. I've always wondered if there could be anywhere else on Earth where it could be any harder to find your golf ball. There were always safety drills to be done. It appears this one models our commander up in the conning tower. Before we knew it, it was Christmas.
What was that you saying about polar stern?
Oh yeah, 20 days. She should be around here to pick us up. Thanks down the Halley. Before we knew it, it was Christmas, and Christmas came complete with a nativity play. The crazy haircuts were a tradition among people who intended to winter. You can't see it here, but I saw someone spray fake decorative snow on those windows while the decorations were going up. To this day, that still cracks me up.
He doesn't like them being away unless he's in them. Because they are a worry because they don't always come back right. I know exactly how he feels. It's all very well having a bimble like this, but it always not. Oh yes!
Oh, well.
Oh, yeah.
Somewhere along the way we found a little puddle, and so we took our chance to run a lifeboat drill. Boat drills happen all the time, but they just don't happen like this all the time. Apparently the penguins agree. I can't imagine dragging these boats across the ice like Shackleton did.
This is our Olympic Games judge, Captain Stuart Lawrence.
Hello, friend.
As the weeks rolled by, rumblings of discontent started to emerge, first from passengers and then even some crew. So a distraction became necessary, and through this the Winter Olympics were born. At times in the ice, our captain appeared to spend entire days up in the conning tower, snoozing occasionally in his chair with his stereo playing the Four Seasons. If we on the bridge were to hit anything too hard, you would hear the click of his mic as he was jolted awake. Shortly afterwards, a few tips might arrive on the radio, and on it would go day after day and week after week. In a further attempt to provide some distraction for the crew and passengers, a bag of mail was delivered by airplane.
Just go down off the stern.
Progress to us when they open up.
Yep, copy.
The reason for the flight was ice observation, but I think that was a cover. Really, the intention was to give people a sense of focus during this long period. It's very difficult to describe, in this day and age especially, what it meant to get a letter in this context, this remote and this far from home.
it out.
The skill of our captain led us further south than any other ship, but the further in we travelled, the harder it became. Sometimes it was not so much about the thickness of the ice. If it was thick, but not under pressure, we could move. If it was under pressure, we could often be pinned by relatively thin ice. We would often have to wait for wind or tide to change and then try again, only to lose a day's progress overnight. In the end, the polar stern never came. Despite all her power, she couldn't make it. And amid deepening concerns around our position, the planes returned. This marked an important point for me personally, because I became hooked. It became obvious to me that this pilot had a better machine than me. I'm now 2 decades into that change. No regrets.
Quite right.
There are only so many people who know what it is to complete the New Year celebrations in broad daylight. Everyone here in the land of the midnight sun, of course, does. I can't help but think that this particular piece of the lonely Weddell Sea has probably never known such an unmerciful racket in the entire history of life on Earth.
All in the spirit of things. Happy New Year, gentlemen.
Happy New Year, right?
Here's an iceberg.
By the time this iceberg appeared as a problem, we were 1,000 miles further south than any other ship in the Weddell Sea.
Goes all the way. Still see it in the picture. All the way, still the same iceberg.
The difficulty was caused by the fact that the bergs are deep and so they follow the current.
Here's the end of it. 5 miles across.
The sea ice, by contrast, will follow the wind, meaning that if you get stuck in the ice, you may still find yourself in harm's way when a berg comes along. Nobody knew exactly what would happen as this berg approached us day by day. The sea ice became higher and higher against our sides as it was crushed by the approaching iceberg. Discussions on evacuation of the ship included 4 helicopter fuel depots from HMS Endurance down to us, but from 1,000 miles away this would be an incredible logistical challenge. Another option was to land twin otters on the iceberg itself. We had mountaineers on board who could climb the face of the cliff. It was clear that if the ship was stuck here for the winter, not all would stay aboard. The intimidation of a berg of this size who wants your position approaching with its radiating cold closer day by day is quite memorable. This berg moved upon us mile by mile. From memory, the current was about 1.5 knots, so it moved that fast. The pressure built and built. At first that seems a slow speed, but yet when you are trapped before it, that seems fairly fast. We tried everything, even moving barges with cranes to roll the ship free, but all to no avail. In the end, the berg was not our downfall, but our blessing in disguise. Some weeks earlier, it had collided with the ice shelf, and as a result, it still had a gyre. As a result of this, it eventually brought us down its side, and from here we could break out into its wake, which was an open water lead to the coast. From the coast, we could follow the shore lead to Halley, and it took us 38 days in all to get to Halley. It should have taken a month less than that. This was my first sighting of the ice shelf itself. Look at the wind howling off its crest, hinting at what desolation lies beyond. However, it was this offshore wind that gave us our shore lead. Finally, Bransfield rested her bows upon a low section of the ice shelf where personnel could be craned ashore for mooring operations and for transfer to Halley Base by Twin Otter. However, all would not go to plan. The aging Bransfield was about to lose propulsion, and this would leave her lying helplessly against the cliff while engineers worked their magic below. The potential for damage was quite high as the ship is not ice class or at this level of the accommodation block. Nonetheless, she was built of the right stuff and came to no harm. The Bransfield had no thrusters, just one screw and one rudder, so the recovery from this position left little opportunity for elegance. As you will see during our stay, these cliffs are inherently unstable. Thankfully, this little outcrop held. The mooring operation was completed by drilling into the ice and then driving four 4x4 timbers into the hole and then using those as bollards. Here in Earth's only continent without a native population, the Antarctic Treaty protects this pristine environment. For that reason, everything that is brought in must also be brought out, and this was a big component of our cargo. That these aircraft could operate on unprepared ice like this was then and remains now a constant source of amazement to me. The Bransfield was a very traditional design of cargo ship with twin decks and McGregor hatches. Even in this time, this was considered old school, but it lent itself exceptionally well to this Antarctic operation. The bridge had to be manned at all times due to the unstable nature of the ice. It was so cold at times that if you threw a cup of coffee out, it would instantly freeze into grains of ice before even reaching the deck. Cargo shifts were 12 hours, which lent itself to a little time to explore as well when off duty. It is a measure of the nature of the operation that vehicles approach the ship with a roof hatch, or sometimes door latched open, to give drivers a chance to escape in the event that the ice would collapse. These powerful snowcats could tow 30-ton sled across the snow. They were a Canadian machine and tuned to run on aviation fuel due to its compatibility with lower temperatures. The hours were long, but the work was busy and the company was good. By the time you reach this far south, I have found that despite all the quirks and characters you might meet, a boring character was never found down here. Boring people don't make it this far.
Take away, Jules.
Yeah, just following the hill.
Yeah, rolling. That's not a bad sign. 12 is front, 19 then.
Camera's running up the edge there, isn't it? See how the water cuts away the ice underneath. And you can see where the ice was here. There's the snowcat tracks up to the edge. That's where it was when it fell away.
Normally the ship would call twice in a season, but we were so late that it was decided to complete the resupply in one visit, and this meant we needed to wait for outbound cargo to be ready, and this wait would in the end cause significant difficulties. The normal water temperature here is minus 1.6 degrees Celsius, which is as cold as seawater can be without freezing. This is why it freezes instantly if it becomes airborne into colder air, such as during bad weather or small boat operations. However, any warming at the surface causes a melted cut into the face of the ice cliff. The ship's cooling water for her generators would be much warmer, and so it would significantly exacerbate this problem during our stay, as you will see later. Here I am on the bridge again. This is the night watch. The low sun and cooler temperatures were the only telltale of the night, but the quieter ship left plenty of time to watch this bizarre little piece of our Earth.
He is, he's going to go under the ice. And the bait, we won with it.
Baby one, is it?
The British Antarctic Survey is an amazing company to work for. The hardship was mostly based around the sadness that long periods of absence from home and loved ones would bring. But listening to the enthusiasm in Rory's voice here, even after many years of service here, I think defines the way people saw this job. It was a privilege to work here, and I remain forever proud of it, as I think do all.
See the saddle, the light patch behind that dorsal fin?
It soon became obvious that there was a resident pod of orca whales hunting up this creek. Just as the ultimate ice situation caused problems for us later on, it would equally do so for them in terms of open water breathing space. Their solution for this was going to be spectacular. The ever-changing light was beautiful. So many shades of white, maybe blues at times, but I could never call it grey. It's a very brief shot, but this debris represents a collapse of the cliff, a sign of things to come. If there was one thing Bransfield brought to Antarctica, it was its own well-equipped toy set.
And 4.2 litres of diesel engine
The route from here to Halley Base was 50 kilometres along a surveyed line over the ice to mitigate the threat of crevasses. To make sure nobody strayed from the path, a black drum was placed every single kilometre. Vehicles travelled in convoy and had to be prepared to stop and await improved conditions if they lost sight of the next drum during the whiteout conditions.
Bridge, K12. Can't see the trip sign now.
K12 bridge, go ahead.
Yeah, we're on the way back now.
This Skidoo trip was to survey a crevasse which was approaching the drum line, and we managed to latch ourselves on for a bit of fun. The polar stern finally got close to us here, as this, I remember, was her helicopter. Bransfield was initially launched with a helicopter, but unfortunately it crashed when misjudging its height above the ice. The lack of a sense of scale when everything is ice or snow can be disorientating, and it proved to be so on that day. This is radar sat footage which we depended on for ice information and planning. Here you see where we are now, and then scrolling up here the iceberg that had trapped us earlier in the season. I'm going to take you on a quick tour of the ship. Modern integrated bridge systems looked so different to this. Ships of this generation were, in the end, like a collection of technological afterthought to look at. Nonetheless, she was well equipped. At the time, there was no SATCOM available at this latitude because any orbiting satellites that did exist would go into sleep mode as they transited this area due to the low population base in Antarctica. Sometimes, when further north, geostationary satellites could be received, but they were so low that you might find yourself having to change course to get the funnel out of the way. HF was the mainstay of our communications with Cambridge, or headquarters, and that's the way our email used to go. But this too was unreliable due to the polar absorption, which is the effect of the magnetic poles on HF communications. Officers and other senior staff had their own cabins further down the stairs and the ranks, or with many of our passengers who were known as FIDs, cabins often had more than one occupant. After each watch, each officer would complete a fire round of the ship and visit all decks and spaces for any sign of trouble. There were 3 bars on board: officers, scientists, and the crew bar. As I would complete my watch and my rounds, I would pass them all in that order. It soon became clear that the only real crack on board was in the crew bar. As a 21-year-old myself, I found some great company, friendship and good times in the crew bar. As an officer, though, I drew some scorn in this from all sides. Some ratings told me I didn't belong because they saw officers as toffs, and the higher ranks then told me I was making a rod for my own back. I sailed in all ranks from the 4th up to chief officer in this company, though, and I never felt that rod upon my back. I think the times are changing.
Bridge to the way. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's right. It's pretty, so I think that's a half an hour later, so I wasn't really probably do it. Yeah, trouble is they will tell you what
This kayaker was our launchman. His name is Rod, and he hailed from the Scottish Islands. He had the foresight to bring along his sea kayak. The slight lull in workload for the ship, which occurred between discharging the inbound cargo and readiness of the outbound cargo, combined with a calm day, which gave Rod this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A few of us were happy to accompany him in the safety boat, and so his trip was on. It was a surreal sight to behold. Sea kayaks of this distinctive design and their clear Inuit lineage are literally a world away from home down here in the far south, but yet also quite at home. This was an unforgettable day. I think it also reminds me clearly how strong the ethos in this company was, which I found to be work hard, play hard. The scale of everything in Antarctica is hard to comprehend or to relate. The scale of the sense of intimidation at the hands of these forces that collapse or change at a moment's notice, the scale of hundreds of miles of these cliffs, the scale of treachery and change at the hands of the sea ice at its feet, all seem very well illustrated from this level, even in the trick of a calm day.
You got a few words for your public? No, I think this Antarctic hero must be the cool, quiet type. How do you do that roll again?
If I could roll this slow, make up size, it's absolutely phenomenal.
You can hear the stroke of Rod's paddle in the freezing surface. It was a reminder of how fickle our open water lead was. This Navy Sea King, flown in from the Argentinian Navy's icebreaker known as the Almirante Irizar. On hearing of the difficulty of our voyage, she had offered to take on an order of fresh provisions. There had been some confusion in the process, and we ended up with a vast amount of mushrooms, which then appeared in every meal in every possible way. But wherever the mistake occurred was irrelevant. Given that we were just 15 years after the Falklands War, this remained a very significant gesture. Along with the mushrooms, the ship's captain was welcomed aboard by our captain. They were both of a similar vintage and had both been a part of the conflict in different ways and on different sides. It was some time before they both emerged from the captain's cabin. Clearly, they had enjoyed a little alcohol to help with the cold and had warmed to each other. I remember the Argentinian commander commenting solemnly as they shook hands and parted ways, "It is a shame about the dead."
Scale, that's Halley. That is where we are. Moving on the coast, there's a bit of a growing off, large bird, and off to the east, and the open sea.
Observe here the busyness and the burden at the bottom of our gangway. None of this would last. The backload was at last ready. Many of these machines were returning to the UK for maintenance. I can't remember how heavy these machines were, something over 15 tons I guess, heavy enough that when you lifted them with the crane, the whole 6,000-ton ship would list under its weight. But our extended stay and the effect it takes on the adjacent ice were becoming a concern. I believe these two sailors were the youngest on board, and they were rarely found using anything less than all of life's opportunities on this ship.
It looks so effortless, don't it?
One night, just like that, nobody heard a thing, but an iceberg was born. One of the aircraft reported that a large section of the shelf had calved. Naturally, the concern was that it would not drift across our creek and knock us in. We launched the rib to go and have a look.
Bit of a big crack, that one, isn't it?
Yeah, that certainly was a big crack. You won't see much bigger. Our safe harbour was not safe by any measure. We were always watching for change, and change was always present. The biggest berg I saw down south was 50 miles across, but far bigger can occur. These forces are infinitely larger than us, and so if doors were closing, we had to be watching, always with an eye to our exit before the coming winter. In the end, though, it would not be the bergs that would trap us. It would be the sea ice, which blew in as the wind changed overnight. With our troubles came the same for the wildlife, who also either had to get up through it for air or down through the ice for food. The orcas here are spy hopping. This is apparently normally a tactic employed to see prey, but it appears they did it here to keep a breathing hole open in the ice. The opportunity arose for a trip up to the base in Halley, and I jumped at it. It was a 4-hour run up the drumline, and with me in the snowcat was the man who built everything you will see here. It was a remarkable structure built on legs in order that it could be jacked up year after year on the snow that forever fell but never melted. Other structures were on sleds and pulled by dozers onto higher snow each year. This would be the template for the next Halley Base, which was moved entirely when this whole section of the Brunt ice shelf ultimately broke out to sea quite recently. Important to note that everything you have seen in this video since we left Signy Island is afloat. Land itself is still 100 miles away from here. You might well ask what all this was for. Well, this is all science and research. This base has already saved the world once. The ozone hole was found here. There was a great deal of atmospheric work going on here. These large radar antennas analysed all above the polar region. Research here gave insight in a way that could not be achieved in more populated parts of Earth. There was also a huge amount of study going on into global warming and the ice cap, as it records our past and predicts our futures. I think what really struck me here was scale. The scale of what was being achieved, the level of organisation it took to succeed, was just vast. Halley is no longer an all-year base, but at this time it was, and it remained so for many years. Looking at this, you can appreciate there is work in the Antarctic for all disciplines, not just scientists, mariners and pilots, but doctors, dentists, steel erectors, mechanics, drivers. All you really need is a crossroads in your life that says, I'm stepping out for a while. I may be some time. As our self-made harbour began to break up around us, it was long past time to go. But now a toll would have to be paid. For Bransfield it would be a painful toll.
Nobody on the game. The result of it when it gets out, the law comes out, and all the game.
In my 10 years at sea, I never saw so much asked of any ship, nor of any other machine of any sort throughout my entire life. The engineers were providing every horse they could. This was the only time I ever heard a funnel actually whistle like this.
Something crumbled.
Yeah, he's closed a crack there this time.
Ice-breaking stern first means ice-breaking rudder and propeller first. But Bransfield's propeller was partly shrouded, so there was a chance. There was no other way out. To do so in sea ice alone is harsh enough, but to do so up against the ram of ice that projects beneath the ice cliff is almost eye-watering to anyone with even the slightest modicum of mechanical sympathy. But the fact remained, we were now alone. The sea ice had just blown in, and now it had consolidated the ship with her back hard against both a proverbial and very real wall of ice. Damage was done in these awful frame-shuddering thuds. Diesel and water mixed in tanks below. She was damaged, but not defeated. And then she was free. The Weddell Sea was freezing over again. Winter was on its way again, along with the night. Our last call at Sydney was also one less call than planned. It seemed by the bladder on the landing craft's deck here that despite it all, we still had at least some fuel to spare. For those of us who got ashore, this was the first walk on dry land in months, although, as mentioned before, Nick and I had some misadventures down here in small boats among the bergs and beaches and instantly freezing spray. Unlike normal ships, ice-class ships don't have bilge keels, so they tend to roll like pigs, but it was still nice to feel the ship in a seaway again. We were back in the company of dolphins, the mighty albatross, and of course, the ever-beautiful South Georgia. We worked the last round of cargo at King Edward Point, and many of the crew felt their feet on dry land again for the first time in so long. I remember the return of the dark night, stumbling around looking for long-forgotten dimmer switches again on the bridge. It felt like such an intrusion. 24-hour daylight was handy. A number of our crews were Falkland Islanders, and this was good for all because it meant access to both Land Rovers and local knowledge. The Islanders were always good to their shipmates in this way. These are windswept and bleak islands at first, but they are also quite unique, quite wild. The further you travel, the more interesting they become. The recent war was raw in everyone's mind at the time, but also it was raw in the mined landscape. The scars were there, and of course, so were the dead. What a tragedy this all was.
Get out. Don't mess in there, was it?
There were a number of historical huts and smaller bases along the Antarctic Peninsula. Rothera was the biggest, and this is Rothera. It is unique in that it has a runway. Place after place, each as beautiful as the last, each inlet as rock-riddled as the next. For my first trip south, it seemed Antarctica would leave the best to last. The beauty in these parts was absolutely unparalleled, but the danger was too. This was the American Palmer Station. The bergs here are quite different to what we had seen in the Weddell Sea. These are more glacial bergs. These channels were barely charted below the waterline. Scant soundings from passing ships stood in place of actual surveys. I found uncharted rocks in my time here, reported them, and now they exist on charts. It was not uncommon. We watched the depth sounder literally constantly and at all times while underway. Charts were usually geometrically accurate in shape, but were often literally more than a mile out of position, as they were drawn up 100 years ago by a man with a sextant in a cloudy sky. This meant GPS was all but useless. Knowing where you were to within 30 centimetres was pointless if the adjacent landmass was out of place by 1.5 miles. Visual bearings and radar work were best, though sometimes the channel might actually be a half mile wider than the charted width, which made even this a guess. And then the channel is like these, and the bottom is just as jagged as what you see here. This can be intense work. Bergs in blizzards at night were difficult in these channels too. Most would appear on radar, but depending on shape, some were invisible to the radar until you were already past them. The lookout and the officer of the watch worked closely in these waters. It was challenging work. The stakes were high, but the rewards were too. I would say all too soon it was all over, but as any sailor knows, when homeward bound it's never all too soon. There is a thing at sea called the channels. When you are away at sea, there comes a point where you know you are in reach of home and it becomes almost unbearable. It is known as the channels because before flying home was common, the trip up the English Channel would be dominated by this straining emotion. It is truly very difficult to explain to those who have never been to sea. Channels aside, this trip was a happy trip. Some of the fids went off the rails a little in the ice, but the crew was a happy crew when all was said and done. Drake Passage shook us down at the gates one more time as we left, lest we forget who's boss. The busy ways of Montevideo were a little overwhelming after the great solitude of the south. The winters we brought out, many after a 2.5-year stint, and especially those with that Halley stare, all went stone mad as far as I could tell. Or maybe that was just their return to sanity. Some painted the town red, old Chicago just painted the pier red. As we near the end, 28 years later for me, I think the best way I can summarise this trip is to say just how many adventures I had to leave out to keep this short. Those adventures all came flooding back during the making of this, with a thrill almost as real as they were back then.
I came home and they were in here. I had my window shut. And I came back from dinner. I came back from dinner and they were both sitting on.
Some flew home, some chose to take the ship home. Maybe time to adjust was good. The sun and the tropics seemed so strange this time around, yet also so welcoming, getting back into our bones as we went. And then we all went home.